I wasn't invited to the wedding. Not a phone call, not a word, not even a polite lie. One day I was folding laundry in my quiet living room, and the next I was staring at photographs floating across my screen of a beachfront ceremony I had never heard about. My only son stood in a tailored suit beside a woman I had never met, kissing her beneath string lights while guests cheered and cameras flashed. I closed my curtains and sat in the dark with my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I told myself to be happy for him, even while something sharp twisted inside my chest. 3 days later, my phone rang. His voice sounded excited, almost impatient, as he said those words I'll never forget. "We're married now. Mom, send me the key to the house in Malibu. Thank you for staying with me today. Please let me know in the comments where you are watching from, because stories like mine deserve witnesses." I sat there on the edge of my sofa listening to my own son speak to me as though I were nothing more than a gatekeeper to his next luxury moment. He did not ask how I was, he did not even pretend to care. He simply expected me to hand over the keys to the house I spent half my life working double shifts to buy. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, pretending I could not hear him clearly, just so I would not start shaking. My mind drifted to all the mornings I left before sunrise to scrub other people's floors so he could have new shoes and proper meals while his classmates carried lunchboxes, their mothers packed with ease. For a few seconds, I could not breathe. I imagined him laughing with his new wife, telling her how easy it would be to enjoy the ocean view and fresh linen sheets of my Malibu home without paying a single hotel bill. I wondered if the woman in that white dress even knew who built that house from nothing but stubborn hope and aching hands. Yet instead of crying, I straightened my spine and said softly that I would send him a package right away. He thanked me quickly, as if it were owed to him, never once asking if I would be lonely, sitting in my small home while they toasted to their future inside my sacrifice. The moment I ended that call, I stared at my reflection in the glass frame above the mantel, and I knew something inside me had snapped. This was not about a house, it was about respect. And I promised myself that whatever I sent to that honeymoon would not unlock any doors, but would close a chapter once and for all. When the call ended, I did not rush to the closet, where I kept the spare key like any ordinary mother might have done. Instead, I walked slowly to the kitchen table and pulled out the drawer where I kept my old documents, the ones that reminded me how far I had crawled to give that boy a name worth carrying. I sat down and ran a single finger over the photograph of myself when I was 35, standing outside that Malibu property before it was even finished. Back when I could barely afford the roof, yet still believed that someday it would be filled with laughter, beach towels, and family dinners. I could almost taste the salt in the air from that very first day I unlocked the front door and promised myself that no matter what happened, I would leave something behind that proved I had not lived quietly for nothing. The people I once cleaned for laughed when I told them I was saving every dollar for a house by the ocean, but I ignored their smirks because I knew what I wanted could not be measured by their opinions. I wanted security, dignity, and most of all, a place my son could inherit one day, and proudly say my mother did this all by herself. Now, years later, he wanted to enjoy it without the simplest gesture of honoring the one person who kept his stomach full and his future bright. As I folded that old photograph back into the drawer, I made another promise, one that came not from pain, but from a new kind of strength. I promised I would never again give what I bled for to someone who could not remember to even offer me a seat at his own life. I reached for my phone not to send the house key, but to call my lawyer, whose number I kept tucked behind the electricity bill. My voice did not tremble as I explained that I wanted the house in Malibu sold immediately. No questions asked, no delays, no sentimental speeches. He hesitated, asking if I was sure, because he remembered how proud I had been when I first bought it. I told him that sometimes pride must take a different shape. That peace was now worth more to me than beachfront property. And with that, the wheels began turning. By dusk, the paperwork was already being prepared, and I started writing the letter that I would send to my son in place of the key he so casually demanded. Every word I placed on that paper felt like a stitch, sewing up a wound that had been open far too long. And by the time I signed my name at the bottom, I realized I was no longer a mother waiting to be included. I was a woman, reclaiming what little time I had left with a heart that had been ignored for too many seasons. I folded that letter with care, placed it inside a gold envelope along with the deed transfer and sale agreement, and when I sealed it, I whispered to myself that sometimes revenge is not loud or cruel. It is simply choosing to remove yourself from the table. Your own flesh forgot to set for you. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, just like I used to when I held 3 jobs to keep food on the table. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat by the window watching the sky change from sleepy gray to soft orange. My heart was steady, not because I felt nothing, but because I knew I was finally doing what I should have done long ago. As the light grew brighter, I thought about how many nights I stayed awake waiting for that boy to come home from college parties, praying he would not get lost in a world that did not care about the woman who paid his tuition. I remembered the day he stood at my front door with tears in his eyes, begging me not to sell the Malibu house, when I considered downsizing after my arthritis made climbing stairs difficult. He said that house was his dream, that he wanted to raise his future children near the water, the same way I had raised him on hope and determination. He promised he would never let it go to waste. I believed him because I wanted to believe that blood meant loyalty. Yet here I was years later watching the ink dry on papers that would end every dream he once claimed to cherish. I placed the gold envelope on the center of my dining table and stared at it as if it were a live thing breathing silently with all my grief and resolve packed inside its folds. It struck me that there is a strange kind of freedom that comes when you finally stop begging someone to see your worth. It does not roar or laugh. It whispers gently and says, "Walk away." After finishing my coffee, I called a courier service to ensure that envelope would arrive exactly 3 days later. The same day he and his new bride planned to unlock my Malibu door and step into what they believed would be a honeymoon soaked in luxury. The courier asked if the contents were fragile, and I smiled as I said yes, because even though the papers inside could not break like glass, they held decades of memories and sacrifices that once felt too delicate to touch. After the pickup, I spent the rest of the day cleaning my small home, not because it was dirty, but because my hands needed something to do, while my heart packed its suitcases full of final decisions. I dusted shelves filled with family photos, letting my fingertips run over the edges of frames that held a younger version of him standing proudly beside me at school graduations. I whispered to each photo that I did my best. When evening fell, I sat down with a blanket draped over my lap and watched the streetlights flicker on outside. I wondered briefly if he would understand the message I was sending, or if he would spin a story that made me look bitter in front of his glamorous new world. Either way, I felt calm because I had not acted out of anger, I had acted out of self-respect. And as I closed my eyes that night, I prayed not for him to return, but for myself to never again forget that I had earned the right to choose peace over pain, even when it meant closing a door that once opened to the sound of my son calling me mother. 3 days passed slowly, as if time itself was testing my conviction. I spent those hours doing ordinary things like watering my plants and folding neatly pressed linens. Yet with every ticking moment I imagined what would soon unfold in a house that once echoed with my laughter and dreams. I pictured my son and his new bride arriving at the Malibu property with suitcases full of designer clothes and camera equipment ready to capture their perfect honeymoon for everyone online to admire. I could almost see them skipping up the steps, expecting champagne and ocean air waiting just for them. Instead, what they would find would be a different family altogether, already unpacking boxes in rooms that no longer belonged to those who forgot me. Knowing this filled me with a strange, quiet satisfaction. Not the kind that boasts or celebrates, but the kind that stands tall even when nobody is clapping. For years, I had been the woman who gave without hesitation, who forgave even when it bruised her heart. Now I had become someone new. A woman who chose to keep her dignity, even if it meant letting go of everything she built to pass on. When the clock struck noon on that third day, I received a notification that the gold envelope had been delivered successfully. I sat frozen, staring at those words on my phone screen, and wondered how long it would take before the first call came through. I didn't have to wonder for long, because as the sun climbed toward its highest point, my phone began to vibrate across the table with his name shining brightly, as if it still held power over me. I let it ring, then ring again and again, until the sound filled the whole room, like an alarm trying to drag me back into a role I finally stepped away from. I did not answer. I watched the screen go black each time until at last it stopped as suddenly as it had started. I imagined in that silence his confusion shifting into disbelief and finally into anger, as he realized what I had done without asking permission or giving any warning. I rested my hand over my chest and felt my heartbeat steady itself, not from fear, but from a sense of closure I never thought I would experience. I whispered to myself that he would survive without that house, just as I had survived without his presence at my table. Sometimes love is not about opening doors, but knowing when to lock them. As night fell, once more, I felt lighter than I had in years. It was not happiness exactly, but it was peace. And at my age, peace is more precious than any ocean view or polished marble floor could ever be. The next morning, I expected the storm to calm. Instead, I woke to messages from relatives I had not spoken to in years. They were demanding to know why I would do something so dramatic as selling the family house. They spoke as if they had ever lifted a hand to help me build it or maintain it. Once again, I was reminded how the world expects a mother to give even when her bones are tired and her heart is cracked open from disappointment. I simply replied that the house was mine to do with as I pleased. After that, I turned off my phone and spent the afternoon sitting in the quiet of my living room, touching the edges of a quilt I had stitched when my son was still a boy, who ran to me when he scraped his knee. The memory stung a little, but not enough to undo the strength I had gathered. Still, I allowed myself to wonder whether he would ever understand that what hurt me most was not being left out of the wedding, but being remembered only when there was something expensive to claim. I thought about the look that must have crossed his bride's face when she opened the envelope expecting a key to wealth, but finding a message of finality instead. Part of me hoped that moment would teach them both that love cannot be treated like an inheritance, waiting to be unlocked. I imagined her tears falling, not out of heartbreak, but out of shock, that someone she barely knew would dare to say no when she had always heard yes. I wondered if they argued, if he tried to call me names or blame me for ruining their honeymoon. I wondered if somewhere deep down he felt ashamed, or if he was only angry that he had lost the chance to parade around in a home he once pretended was built for him. I looked around at my modest surroundings and realized I did not regret my decision for even a second. Because sometimes the greatest act of love you can offer your own blood is teaching them that boundaries are not walls meant to keep them out. They are signs that say I respect myself enough not to be used again. As the day came to an end, the last bit of sunlight spilled across my floor like a quiet blessing. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, reminding myself that I did not need a mansion by the sea to feel proud. I only needed to know that I had finally chosen myself after a lifetime of choosing everyone else. By the time another week passed, I heard through a distant cousin that my son and his new wife had returned from their failed honeymoon much sooner than planned. Apparently, they were too embarrassed to explain why their trip ended before it properly began. And so they pretended it was a simple change of plans. I could picture them walking into their apartment in the city, avoiding questions from friends who had watched them announce they were off to Malibu for a romantic getaway. I imagined them deleting posts and smiling through clenched teeth at anyone who asked how the ocean breeze had treated them. It would have been easy to feel triumphant, but instead, I felt a quiet wave of sorrow, followed by a deeper resolve. I refused to let regret sink its claws into my spirit, because I knew, the moment I let him walk over my boundaries again, I would lose not only the house, but every inch of self-respect I had clawed my way toward. I spent one of those evenings baking a simple loaf of bread, the way I used to when he was younger. and my kitchen smelled of yeast and hope. While it baked, I wrote out a new plan for my future, one where I would take the money from the sale and travel slowly across small towns I had always wanted to see, but had postponed because I thought I should stay rooted and ready to help at any moment. I wrote down places like Savannah and Charleston, imagining myself sitting on quiet park benches, feeding birds, and smiling at strangers who did not know me, but would perhaps treat me with more kindness than those who shared my blood. Each slice of bread I cut reminded me that comfort can be made from even the simplest ingredients, if the heart behind them is steady. I told myself that just as I had once built a life from nothing, I would build again this time, without expecting anyone else to applaud. I would take photographs for myself instead of for social approval. I would eat dinners by candlelight, even if I was the only one at the table, because life does not end when others walk away. It begins anew when you decide you were enough all along. As I washed the dishes that night, I looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window and saw not a woman abandoned, but a woman reborn, no longer waiting for a knock that never comes, but stepping out into the world on her own 2 feet, carrying her story in her palms like an offering of truth to whoever might listen, without asking for more than she can give. A few evenings later, as I sat arranging my travel brochures and circling dates on a calendar, I heard a soft knock on my door. For a moment, I thought it might be a neighbor needing sugar, or perhaps the postman with a parcel I had forgotten I ordered. But when I opened the door, there stood my son, his shoulders slightly hunched, as though the weight of unspoken words pressed down on him harder than he expected. I stepped aside without saying anything, allowing him to come in, because even though my heart felt betrayed, my home training would not let me leave him standing outside like a stranger. He looked around at the familiar surroundings, and I could tell by the way his eyes landed on old photographs that he was wrestling with memories he had tried to push aside. He cleared his throat and said he wanted to talk. I did not offer him tea. I simply nodded and sat back down, letting him stand while he gathered his courage. After a long stretch of silence, he finally admitted that he had been wrong to exclude me from his wedding, and that his wife had been furious when she realized the Malibu house was no longer theirs to show off. I listened without interrupting, because I had learned that sometimes people reveal more when you do not rush to fill the quiet. He apologized, not in the way a man apologizes when he truly sees the pain he has caused, but in the way someone apologizes when life reminds them that they cannot control everything. He asked how I could sell the house without telling him. I raised my eyes and said I did not need to announce my decisions to people who made it clear that my presence was optional. My voice did not tremble and my hands did not shake, because when you walk through fire long enough, your skin hardens in ways nobody sees. He tried to say that he was hoping to surprise me later by inviting me to a dinner after his honeymoon, that I had misunderstood his intentions, yet the look in his eyes told me even he did not believe his own words. When the room grew heavy with discomfort, I stood up and walked to the small table, where my quilt lay draped over unfinished stitching. I told him that I wished him nothing but joy in his marriage, and that I hoped he built a home filled with love instead of entitlement. I did not raise my voice or shed a tear. I simply opened the door and let him know gently that our stories would not continue down the same path unless he learned the difference between ownership and love. He stepped out hesitating as though he wanted to say more, but I gave him a soft smile, the kind that carries years of heartache disguised as grace. And I closed the door quietly, feeling my soul exhale with relief. Because sometimes the hardest thing a mother can do is to stop rescuing a grown man from the consequences of his choices. As I leaned back against that door, I felt the first true taste of freedom I had experienced in decades, and it tasted like courage wrapped in silence. Later that night, I sat alone in my living room, turning over everything that had happened with a mixture of relief and tender sadness. I wondered whether he would ever truly understand why I did what I did, or if he would spend the rest of his life believing I acted out of spite rather than self-respect. The quiet around me felt different, now softer somehow, as though my house itself was proud of me for finally protecting my spirit. I picked up my calendar and stared at the dates I had marked for my travels, feeling a flutter of excitement that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with possibility. Just as I was folding the corner of a brochure that showed a beautiful old southern street lined with trees, I realized that maybe this was what life had been waiting to give me all along. Not grand gestures or applause, but the simple chance to begin again on my own terms without waiting for permission or gratitude. When morning arrived, I placed my suitcase on the bed and started packing slowly, choosing my favorite cotton dresses and comfortable walking shoes. It felt almost surreal to be planning a journey for myself after years of planning everything around someone else's needs. I tucked away my medicine, a well-worn journal, and a small framed photo from the early days when my smile was wide and untouched by disappointment. Each item I packed felt like a promise to the woman I used to be. A woman who once dreamed of exploring the world instead of waiting near the phone for a call that never came. I stepped back and looked at the open suitcase, feeling a mixture of nerves and joy. Because even though I had no one waiting for me at the next destination, I finally had something better than company. I had my peace. I walked through my house one last time, touching the furniture that had witnessed my sorrows and my triumphs, thanking each quiet corner for sheltering me when I felt invisible and discarded. I whispered that it was time for me to step into the sunlight again, not as someone's caretaker, but as someone worthy of her own adventures. After locking up, I rolled my suitcase down the steps and into the waiting cab, giving the driver the address of the train station with a soft determination in my voice that surprised even me. As we drove away, I did not look back at the familiar street I had known for so many years. Instead, I leaned forward, watching new scenery unfold through the window, like a fresh page of my life turning itself with gentle insistence. I felt no anger toward my past, only gratitude that it had finally taught me the difference between being needed and being valued. As the train station came into view, I held my ticket with steady hands and stepped forward, knowing that the journey ahead was not just across miles, but into the heart of a future where my happiness no longer depended on anyone's invitation or approval. I smiled to myself, certain that somewhere along the way I would meet small joys waiting just for me. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to receive them. As I settled into my seat by the train window and listened to the low rumble beneath my feet, I felt a tender thrill rise within me. I watched the landscape slowly shift from familiar buildings to wide fields and small forgotten towns. It amazed me how a change of scenery could stir something awake in a heart that had once gone numb from disappointment. I opened my journal and began to write, not about pain or betrayal, but about possibility. I wrote that I wanted to try new foods, walk down streets with names I could barely pronounce, and smile at strangers without wondering if I would ever see them again. Each word brought me closer to myself and further from the version of me who had stayed behind for far too long, waiting for someone else to choose her. Every now and then I thought of my son and wondered if he was still angry or had started to understand that a mother's love is not something to be summoned when convenient, but something to be honored while it is still near. Yet instead of letting those thoughts pull me back, I let them drift like passing clouds outside the window. Because deep in my spirit, I knew that forgiveness was less about letting him off the hook and more about freeing myself from the weight of expectations that had kept me chained to a life that did not value my sacrifices. I closed my journal and placed my hand gently against the cool glass, watching the world whoosh faster now, as though it too was eager to carry me to my next chapter. And for the first time in a long time, I whispered softly to my own reflection that I was proud of the woman I had become, not because she was perfect, but because she finally understood that loving herself was the beginning of everything she once hoped to find in someone else. When the train finally slowed to a stop at my first destination, I stepped onto the platform with my suitcase in one hand and a quiet smile curving across my face. There was a gentle breeze carrying the scent of magnolia blossoms that reminded me how life could surprise us with beauty, even after we have weathered storms that tried to hollow us out. I made my way down winding streets past vintage shops and small bakeries, their windows glowing with warm light. For a moment, it felt as though I had slipped into a dream that belonged to someone younger and braver than the woman I had become over the years of holding my breath and tiptoeing around disappointment. Yet with each step I took, I felt myself growing lighter, as though I were shedding old griefs like a coat that no longer fit my shoulders. I stopped at a corner cafe and ordered a cup of tea with honey, letting the steam rise into my face as though it were blessing me with a new beginning I never dared to ask for. While I sipped, I thought about the younger version of myself, who used to believe that love meant sacrificing everything without complaint. And I wanted to tell her that love can also mean drawing a line where your heart refuses to be trampled. I thought about how many women lose themselves in the act of giving until they are little more than shadows in their own homes, and how powerful it is to reclaim yourself, even if it means walking away from the ones you once thought would walk beside you forever. I sat there for a long while, watching people pass by, imagining their stories and wondering if anyone else around me had chosen peace over approval. Somewhere deep inside my chest, a new truth was taking root. One that whispered, I did not need to be someone's first choice to be worthy. I simply needed to be my own. And as I finished the last sip of tea, I felt ready to keep moving. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is not punishment, but happiness, blooming exactly where someone expected you to wither. With my suitcase in hand, I rose from that cafe table and walked toward the next street, feeling a soft thrill I had almost forgotten. Behind me lay years of bending so others could stand tall, and ahead of me stretched a future stitched together, not by sacrifice but by choice. As I crossed the road, I turned once more toward the life I had left behind, and quietly forgave it for not turning out the way I had dreamed. Then I faced forward, knowing that the truest form of strength is not holding on to what hurts, but letting go so something better can find you. Thank you for staying with me to the end of my story. Your presence means more than I can say. Please subscribe if you would love to hear my next truth, because I have many more still tucked safely inside my heart.